Relax and listen to the voice.
Welcome back once again to Classic Horror and Other Stories. Please subscribe to the channel, please like this video, and share this with your friends. Leave us a comment and let us know what your favorite story was from this installment. Alright, well with that said, here we go. A Vine on a House by Ambrose Bierce. About 3 miles from the little town of Norton in Missouri, on the road leading to Maysville, stands an old house that was last occupied by a family named Harding. Since 1886, no one has lived in it, nor is anyone likely to live in it again. Time and the disfavor of persons dwelling thereabout are converting it into a rather picturesque ruin. An observer unacquainted with its history would hardly put it into the category of haunted houses, yet in all the region round, such is its evil reputation. Its windows are without glass, its doorways without doors. There are wide breaches in the shingle roof, and for lack of paint, the weatherboarding is a dun gray. But these unfailing signs of the supernatural are partly concealed and greatly softened by the abundant foliage of a large vine overrunning the entire structure. This vine, of a species which no botanist has ever been able to name, has an important part in the story of the house. The Harding family consisted of Robert Harding, his wife Matilda, Miss Julia Went, who was her sister, and 2 young children. Robert Harding was a silent, cold-mannered man who made no friends in the neighborhood and apparently cared to make none. He was about 40 years old, frugal and industrious, and made a living from the little farm which is now overgrown with brush and brambles. He and his sister-in-law were rather tabooed by their neighbors, who seemed to think that they were seen too frequently together. Not entirely their fault, for at these times they evidently did not challenge observation. The moral code of rural Missouri is stern and exacting. Mrs. Harding was a gentle, sad-eyed woman, lacking a left foot. At some time in 1884, it became known that she had gone to visit her mother in Iowa. That was what her husband said in reply to inquiries, and his manner of saying it did not encourage further questioning. She never came back, and 2 years later, without selling his farm or anything that was his, or appointing an agent to look after his interests, or removing his household goods, Harding, with the rest of the family, left the country. Nobody knew whither he went. Nobody at that time cared. Naturally, whatever was movable about the place soon disappeared, and the deserted home became haunted in the manner of its kind. One summer evening, 4 or 5 years later, the Reverend J. Gruber of Norton and a Maysville attorney named Hyatt met on horseback in front of the Harding place. Having business matters to discuss, they hitched their animals and, going to the house, sat on the porch to talk. Some humorous reference to the somber reputation of the place was made and forgotten as soon as uttered, and they talked of their business affairs until it grew almost dark. The evening was oppressively warm, the air stagnant. Presently, both men started from their seats in surprise. A long vine that covered half the front of the house and dangled its branches from the edge of the porch above them was visibly and audibly agitated, shaking violently in every stem and leaf. "We shall have a storm," Hyatt exclaimed. Gruber said nothing, but silently directed the others' attention to the foliage of adjacent trees, which showed no movement. Even the delicate tips of the boughs, silhouetted against the clear sky, were motionless. They hastily passed down the steps to what had been a lawn, and looked upward at the vine, whose entire length was now visible. It continued in violent agitation, yet they could discern no disturbing cause.
"Let us leave,"
said the minister. And leave they did. Forgetting that they had been traveling in opposite directions, they rode away together. They went to Norton, where they related their strange experience to several discreet friends. The next evening, at about the same hour, accompanied by two others whose names are not recalled, they were all again on the porch of the Harding house, and again the mysterious phenomenon occurred. The vine was violently agitated while under the closest scrutiny from root to tip, nor did their combined strength applied to the trunk serve to still it. After an hour's observation, they retreated, no less wise, it is thought, than when they had come. No great time was required for these singular facts to rouse the curiosity of the entire neighborhood. By day and by night, crowds of persons assembled at the Harding house, seeking a sign. It does not appear that any found it, yet so credible were the witnesses mentioned that none doubted the reality of the manifestations to which they testified. By either a happy inspiration or some destructive design, it was one day proposed, nobody appeared to know from whom the suggestion came, to dig up the vine. And after a good deal of debate, this was done. Nothing was found but the root, yet nothing could have been more strange. 5 or 6 feet from the trunk, which had at the surface of the ground a diameter of several inches, it ran downward, single and straight, into a loose, friable earth. Then it divided and subdivided into rootlets, fibers and filaments, most curiously interwoven. When carefully freed from soil, they showed a singular formation. In their ramifications and doublings back upon themselves, they made a compact network, having in size and in shape an amazing resemblance to the human figure. Head, trunk, and limbs were there. Even the fingers and toes were distinctly defined, and many professed to see in the distribution and arrangement of the fibers in the globular mass representing the head a grotesque suggestion of a face. The figure was horizontal. The smaller roots had begun to unite at the breast. In point of resemblance to the human form, this image was imperfect. At about 10 inches from one of the knees, the cilia forming that leg had abruptly doubled backward and inward upon their course of growth. The figure lacked the left foot. There was but one inference, the obvious one. But in the ensuing excitement, as many courses of action were proposed as there were incapable counselors. The matter was settled by the sheriff of the county, who, as the lawful custodian of the abandoned estate, ordered the root replaced and the excavation filled with the earth that had been removed. Later inquiry brought out only one fact of relevancy and significance. Mrs. Harding had never visited her relatives in Iowa, nor did they know that she was supposed to have done so. Of Robert Harding and the rest of his family, nothing is known. The house retains its evil reputation, but the replanted vine is as orderly and well-behaved a vegetable as a nervous person could wish to sit under of a pleasant night, when the katydids grate out their immemorial revelation, and the distant whippoorwill signifies his notion of what ought to be done about it. The Satyr by Clark Ashton Smith. Raoul, Comte de la Frenay, was by nature the most unsuspicious of husbands. His lack of suspicion, perhaps, was partly lack of imagination, and, for the rest, was doubtless due to the dulling of his observational faculties by the heavy wines of Aberwania. At any rate, he had never seen anything amiss in the friendship of his wife, Adele, with Oliver du Montois, a young poet who might, in time, have rivaled Ronsard as one of the most brilliant luminaries of the Pleiad, if it had not been for an unseen but fatal circumstance. Indeed, Monsieur le Comte had been rather proud than otherwise, because of the interest shown in Madame la Comtesse by this erudite and comely youth who had already moistened his lips at the fount of Helicon, and was becoming known throughout other provinces than Aberwania for his melodious villanelles and graceful ballads. Nor was Raoul disturbed by the fact that many of these same villanelles and ballads were patently written in celebration of Adele's visible charms, and made liberal mention of her wine-dark tresses, her golden eyes, and sundry other details no less alluring and equally essential to feminine perfection. Monsieur le Comte did not pretend to understand poetry. Like many others, he considered it something apart from all common sense or mundane relevancy, and his mental powers became totally paralyzed whenever they were confronted by anything in rhyme and meter. In the meanwhile, the ballads and their author were gradually waxing in boldness. That year, the snows of an austere winter had melted away in a week of halcyon warmth, and the land was filled with the tender green and chrysolite and chrysoprase of early spring. Olivier came oftener and oftener to the Chateau de la Frenay, and he and Adele were often alone, since they had so much to talk that was beyond the interest or the comprehension of Monsieur le Comte. And now, sometimes they walked abroad in the forest about the chateau, the forest that rolled a sea of vernal verdure, almost to the gray walls of the Barbican, and within whose sun-warm glades the perfume of the first wild flowers was tinging delicately the quiet air. If people gossiped, they did so discreetly and beyond hearing of Raoul, or of Adele and Olivier. All things being as they were, it is hard to know just why Monsieur le Comte became suddenly troubled concerning the integrity of his marital honor. Perhaps, in some interim of the hunting and drinking between which he divided nearly all his time, he had noticed that his wife was growing younger and fairer, and was blooming as a woman never blooms except to the magical sunlight of love. Perhaps he had caught some glance of ardent or affectionate understanding between Adele and Olivier, or perhaps it was the influence of a premature spring which had pierced the finest muddlement of his brain with an obscure stirring of forgotten thoughts and emotions, and thus had given him a flash of insight. At any rate, he was troubled when, on this afternoon of earliest April, he returned to the chateau from Vian's, where he had gone on business, and learned from his servitors that Madame la Comtesse and Olivier du Montois had left a few minutes previously for a promenade in the forest. His dull face, however, betrayed little. He seemed to reflect for a moment, then, "Which way did they go? I have reason to see Madame la Comtesse at once." His servants gave him the required direction, and went out, following slowly the footpath they had indicated, till he was beyond sight of the chateau. Then he quickened his pace, and began to finger the hilt of his rapier as he went on through the thickening woods. "I am a little afraid, Olivier. Shall we go any further?" Adele and Olivier had wandered beyond the limits of their customary stroll, and were nearing a portion of the forest of Aberwania, where the trees were older and taller than the others. Here, some of the huge oaks were said to date back to pagan days. Few people ever passed beneath them, and queer beliefs and legends concerning them had been prevalent among the local peasantry for ages. Things had been seen within these precincts whose very existence was an affront to science and a blasphemy to religion, and evil influences were said to attend those who dared to intrude upon the sullen umbrage of the immemorial glades and thickets. The beliefs varied, and the legends were far from explicit, but all agreed that the wood was haunted by some entity inimical to man, some primordial spirit of ill that was ancienter than Christ or Satan. Panic, madness, demoniac possession, or baleful, unreasoning passions that led to the doom were the lot of all who had trodden the demesnes of this entity. There were those who whispered what the spirit was, who told incredible tales regarding its true nature and described its true aspect, but such tales were not meant for the ear of devout Christians.
"Prithee, let us go on,"
said Olivier.
"Look you, madame, and see how the ancient trees have put on the emerald freshness of April. How innocently they rejoice in the sun's return."
"But the stories people tell, Olivier?"
"They are stories to frighten children. Let us go on. There is nothing to harm us here, but much of beauty to enchant."
Indeed, as he had said, the great-limbed oaks and venerable beeches were fresh with their newborn foliage. The forests wore an aspect of blitheness and vertuminal gaiety, and it was hard to believe the old superstitions and legends. The day was one of those days when hearts that feel the urgency of an unavowed love are fain to wander indefinitely. So after certain feminine demurs and many reassurances, Adele allowed Oliver to persuade her, and they meant on. The feet of animals, if not of men, had continued the path they were following, and had made an easy way into the wood of fabulous evil. The drooping boughs enfolded them with the arms of soft verdure, and seemed to draw them in, and shafts of yellow sunshine rifted the high trees to aureole the lovely secret lilies that bloomed about the darkly writhing coils of enormous roots. The trees were twisted and knotted, were heavy with centurial incrustations of bark, were humped and misshapen with the growth of unremembered years, but there was an air of antique wisdom about them, together with a tranquil friendliness. Adele exclaimed with delight, and neither she nor Olivier was aware of anything sinister or doubtful in the unison of exquisite beauty and gnarled quaintness which the old forest offered to them.
"Was I not right?" Olivier queried. "Is there aught to fear in harmless trees and flowers?"
Adele smiled, but made no other answer. In the circle of bright sunlight where they were now standing, she and Olivier looked at each other with a new and pervasive intimacy. There was a strange perfume on the windless air, coming in slow wafts from an undiscernible source, a perfume that seemed to speak insidiously of love and languor and amorous yielding. Neither knew the flower from which it issued, for all at once there were many unfamiliar blossoms around their feet, with heavy bells of carnel, white or pink, or curled with twining petals, or hearts like a rosy wound. Looking, they saw each other as in a sudden dazzle of flame, and each felt a violent quickening of the blood, as if they had drunk a sovereign philtre. The same thought was manifest in the bold fervor of Olivier's eyes, and the modest flush upon the cheeks of Madame la Comtesse. The long-cherished love, which neither had openly declared up to this hour, was clamoring importunately in the veins of both. They resumed their onward walk, and both were now silent through the self-same feeling of embarrassment and constraint. They dared not look at each other, and neither of them had eyes for the changing character of the wood through which they wandered, and neither saw the foul, obscene deformity of the gray bolls that gathered on each hand, or the shameful and monstrous fungi that reared their spotted pallor in the shade, or the red, venomous flowers that flaunted themselves in the sun. The spell of their desire was upon the lovers. They were drugged with the mandragora of passion, and everything beyond their own bodies, their own hearts, the throbbing of their own delirious blood, was vaguer than a dream. The wood grew thicker, and the arching boughs above were a weft of manifold gloom. The eyes of ferine animals peered from their hidden burrows with gleams of crafty crimson or chill, ferocious beryl, and the dank smell of stagnant waters, choked with the leaves of bygone autumn, arose to greet Adele and Olivier, and to break a little the perilous charm that possessed them. They paused on the edge of a rock-encircled pool, above which the ancient alders twined their decaying tops, as if to maintain forever the mad posture of a superannuate frenzy. And there, between the nether boughs of the alders and a frame of new leaves, they saw the face that leered upon them. The apparition was incredible, and for the space of a long breath, they could not believe they had really seen it. There were two horns and a matted mass of coarse, animal-like hair above the semi-human face, with its obliquely slitted eyes, fang-revealing mouth, and beard of wild boar bristles. The face was old, incomputably old, and its lines and wrinkles were those of unreckoned years of lust, and its look was filled with the slow, unceasing increment of all the malignity and corruption and cruelty of elder ages. It was the face of Pan, as he glared from his secret wood upon travelers taken unaware. Adele and Olivier were seized by a nightmare terror as they recalled the old legends. The charm of their passionate obsession was broken, and the drug of desire relinquished its hold on their senses. Like people awakened from a heavy sleep, they saw the face and heard through the tumult of their blood the cachinnation of a wild and evil and panic laughter as the apparition vanished among the boughs. Shuddering, Adele flung herself for the first time into the arms of her lover.
"Did you see it?"
she whispered as she clung to him. Olivier drew her close. In that delicious nearness, the horrible thing he had seen and heard became somehow improbable and unreal. There must have been a double sorcery abroad to lull his horror thus, but he knew not whether the thing had been a momentary hallucination, a fantasy wrought by the sun amid the alder leaves, or the demon that was fabled to dwell in Avernier. And the startlement he had felt was somehow without meaning or reason. He could even thank the apparition, whatever it was, because it had thrown Adele into his embrace. He could think of nothing now but the proximity of that warm, delectable mouth for which he had hungered so long. He began to reassure her, to make light of her fears, to pretend that she could have seen nothing, and his reassurances merged into ardent protestations of love. He kissed her, and they both forgot the vision of the satyr. They were lying on a gatch of golden moss, where the sun rays fell through a single cleft in the high foliage, when Raoul found them. They did not see or hear him as he paused and stood with drawn rapier before the vision of their unlawful happiness. He was about to fling himself upon them and impale the two with a single thrust where they lay, when an unlooked-for and scarce conceivable thing occurred. With swiftness veritably supernatural, a brown, hairy creature, a being that was not wholly man, not wholly animal, but some hellish mixture of both, sprang from amid the alder branches and snatched Adele from Olivier's embrace. Olivier and Raoul saw it only in one fleeting glimpse, and neither could have described it clearly afterwards. But the face was that which had leered upon the lovers from the foliage, and the shaggy legs and body were those of a creature of antique legend. It disappeared as incredibly as it had come, bearing the woman in its arms, and her shrieks of terror were surmounted by the pealing of its mad, diabolical laughter. The shrieks and laughter died away at some distant remove in the green silence of the forest, and were not followed by any other sound. Raoul and Olivier could only stare at each other in complete stupefaction. Wireless Confusion by Algernon Blackwood.
"Good night, Uncle,"
whispered the child as she climbed onto his knee and gave him a resounding kiss.
"It's time for me to disapop into bed. At least so Mother says."
Disapop then, he replied, returning her kiss. Although I doubt.
He hesitated. He remembered the word was her father's invention, descriptive of the way rabbits pop into their holes and disappear, and the way good children should leave the room the instant bedtime was announced. The father, his twin brother, seemed to enter the room and stand beside them.
Then give me another kiss and disapop, he said quickly.
The child obeyed the first part of his injunction, but had not obeyed the second when the queer thing happened. She had not left his knee. He was still holding her at the full stretch of both arms. He was staring into her laughing eyes when she suddenly went far away into an extraordinary distance. She retired. Minute, tiny, but still in perfect proportion and clear as before, she was withdrawn in space till she was small as a doll. He saw his own hands holding her, and they too were minute. Down this long corridor of space, as it were, he saw her diminutive figure.
"Uncle!"
she cried, yet her voice was loud as before.
"But what a funny face! You're pretending you've seen a ghost!"
And she was gone from his knee and from the room, the door closing quietly behind her. He saw her cross the floor, a tiny figure. Then, just as she reached the door, she became of normal size again, as if she crossed a line. He felt dizzy. The loud voice close to his ear, issuing from a diminutive figure half a mile away, had a distressing effect upon him. He knew a curious qualm as he sat there in the dark. He heard the wind walking round the house, trying the doors and windows. He was troubled by a memory he could not seize. Yet the emotion instantly resolved itself into one of personal anxiety. Something had gone wrong with his eyes. Sight, his most precious possession as an artist, was of course affected. He was conscious of a little trembling in him, and he at once began trying his sight at various objects. His hands, the high ceiling, the trees dim in the twilight on the lawn outside. He opened a book and read half a dozen lines at changing distances. Finally, he stared carefully at the second hand of his watch.
Right as a trivet,
he exclaimed aloud. He emitted a long sigh. He was immensely relieved.
Nothing wrong with my eyes.
He thought about the actual occurrence a great deal. He felt as puzzled as any other normal person must have felt. While he held the child actually in his arms, gripping her with both hands, he had seen her suddenly half a mile away. "Half a mile!" he repeated under his breath. "Why, it was even more. It was easily a mile." It had been exactly as though he suddenly looked at her down the wrong end of a powerful telescope. It had really happened. He could not explain it. There was no more to be said. This was the first time it happened to him. At the theater, a week later, when the phenomenon was repeated, the stage he was watching fixedly at the moment went far away, as though he saw it from a long way off. The distance, so far as he could judge, was the same as before, about a mile. It was an Eastern scene, realistically costumed and produced, that without an instant's warning withdrew. The entire stage went with it, although he did not actually see it go. He did not see movement, that is. It was suddenly remote, while yet the actors' voices, the orchestra, the general hubbub retained their normal volume. He experienced again the distressing dizziness. He closed his eyes, covering them with his hand, then rubbing the eyeballs slightly, and when he looked up the next minute, the world was as it should be, as it had been, at any rate. Unwilling to experience a repetition of the thing in a public place, however, and fortunately being alone, he left the theater at the end of the act. Twice this happened to him, once with an individual, his brother's child, and once with a landscape, an Eastern stage scene. Both occurrences were within the week, during which time he had been considering a visit to the oculist, though without putting his decision into execution. He was the kind of man that dreaded doctors, dentists, and oculists, always postponing, always finding reasons for delay. He found reasons now, the chief among them being an unwelcome one, that it was perhaps a brain specialist rather than an oculist he ought to consult. This particular notion hung unpleasantly about his mind when, the day after the theater visit, the thing recurred, but with a startling difference. While idly watching a blue bottlefly that climbed the window pane with remorseless industry, only to slip down again at the very instant when escape into the open air was within its reach, the fly grew abruptly into gigantic proportions, became blurred and indistinct as it did so, covered the entire pane with its furry, dark, ugly mass, and frightened him so that he stepped back with a cry and nearly lost his balance altogether. He collapsed into a chair. He listened with closed eyes. The metallic buzzing was audible, a small, exasperating sound, ordinarily unable to stir any emotion beyond a mild annoyance. Yet it was terrible that so huge an insect should make so faint a sound, seemed to him terrible. At length, he cautiously opened his eyes. The fly was of normal size once more. He hastily flicked it out of the window. An hour later, he was talking with the famous oculist in Harley Street about the advisability of starting reading glasses. He found it difficult to relate the rest. A curious shyness restrained him.
"Your optic nerves might belong to a man of 20,
was the verdict.
Both are perfect, but at your age it is wise to save the sight as much as possible. There is a slight astigmatism."
And a prescription for the glasses was written out. It was only when paying the fee, and as a means of drawing attention from the awkward moment, that his story found expression. It seemed to come out in spite of himself. He made light of it even then, telling it without conviction. It seemed foolishly sudden as he told it.
"How very odd,"
observed the oculist vaguely.
"Dear me, yes, curious indeed. But that's nothing.
Either it was no concern of his, or he deemed it negligible. His only other confidant was a friend of psychological tendencies who was interested and eager to explain. It is on the instant plausible explanation of anything and everything that the reputation of such folk depends. This one was true to type.
"A spontaneous invention, my dear fellow. A pictorial rendering of your thought. You are a painter, aren't you? Well, this is merely a rendering in picture form of—"
He paused for effect, or hung upon his words.
"Of the odd expression, disapop." Ah,
exclaimed the painter.
you see everything pictorially, of course, don't you?
Yes, as a rule.
Well, there you have it. Your painter psychology saw the child dis-a-popping, that's all.
And the fly? But the fly was easily explained, since it was merely the process reversed.
Once a process has established itself in your mind, you see, it may act in either direction. When a madman says, "I'm afraid Smith will do me an injury," it means, "I will do an injury to Smith."
And he repeated it with finality.
That's it.
The explanations were not very satisfactory, the illustrations even tactless. But then, the problem had not been stated quite fully. Neither to the oculist nor to the other had all the facts been given. The same shyness had been a restraining influence in both cases. A detail had been omitted, and this detail was that he connected the occurrences somehow with his brother, whom the war had taken. The phenomenon made once more appearance. The last, before its character, its field of action rather, altered. He was reading a book when the print became now large, now small. It blurred, grew remote and tiny, then so huge that a single word, a letter even, filled the whole page. He felt as if someone were playing optical tricks with the mechanisms of his eyes, trying first one, then another focus. More curious still, the meaning of the words themselves became uncertain. He did not understand them anymore. The sentences lost their meaning, as though he read a strange language or a language little known. The flash came then. Someone was using his eyes. Someone else was looking through them. No, it was not his brother. The idea was preposterous in any case. Yet he shivered again, as when he heard the walking wind, for an uncanny conviction came over him that it was someone who did not understand eyes, but was manipulating their mechanisms experimentally. With the conviction came also this, that while not his brother, it was someone connected with his brother. Here, moreover, was an explanation of sorts, for if the supernatural existed, he had never troubled his head about it. He could accept this odd business as a manifestation and leave it at that. He did so, and his mind was eased. That was his attitude. The supernatural may exist. Why not? We cannot know, but we can watch. His eyes and brain, at any rate, were proved in good condition. He watched. No change of focus, no magnifying or diminishing came again. For some weeks he noticed nothing unusual of any kind, except that his mind often filled now with Eastern pictures. Their sudden eruption caught his attention, but no more than that. They were sometimes blurred and sometimes vivid. He had never been in the East. He attributed them to his constant thinking of his brother, missing in Mesopotamia these 6 months. Photographs in magazines and newspapers explained the rest. Yet the persistence of the pictures puzzled him. Tents beneath hot, cloudless skies, palms, a stretch of desert, dry watercourses, camels, a mosque, a minaret. Typical snatches of this kind flashed into his mind with a sense of faint familiarity often. He knew, again, the return of a fugitive memory he could not seize. He kept a note of all the dates, all of them subsequent to the day he read his brother's fate in the official roll of honor. Believed missing, now killed. Only when the original phenomenon returned, but in its altered form, did he stop the practice. The change then affected his life too fundamentally to trouble about mere dates and pictures. For the phenomenon, shifting its field of action, abruptly became mental, and a singular change of focus took place now in his mind. Events magnified or contracted themselves out of all relation with their intrinsic values. Sense of proportion was hopelessly astray. Love, hate, and fear experienced sudden intensification or abrupt dwindling into nothing. The familiar, everyday emotions, commonplace daily acts, suffered exaggerated enlargement or reduction into insignificance that threatened the stability of his personality. Fortunately, as stated, they were of brief duration. To examine them in detail were to touch the painful absurdities of incipient mania almost. That a lost collar stud could block his exasperated mind for hours, filling an entire day with emotion, while a deep affection of long standing could ebb towards complete collapse suddenly without apparent cause. It was the unexpected suddenness of Turkey's spectacular defeat that closed the painful symptoms. The armistice saw them go. He knew a quick relief he was unable to explain. The telegram that his brother was alive and safe came after his recovery of mental balance. It was a shock, but the phenomena had ceased before the shock. It was in the light of his brother's story that he reviewed the puzzling phenomena described. The story was not more curious than many other, perhaps, yet the details were queer enough that a wounded Turk to whom he gave water should have remembered gratitude was likely enough, for all travelers know that these men are kindly gentlemen at times, but that this Mohammedan peasant should have been later a member of a prisoner's escort and have provided the means of escape and concealment. Weeks in a dry watercourse and months in a hut outside the town seemed an incredible stroke of good fortune.
He brought me food and water 3 times a week. I had no money to give him, so I gave him my Zeiss glasses. I taught him a bit of English, too, but he liked the glasses best. He was never tired of playing with them, making big and little, as he called it. He learned precious little English.
My pair, weren't they? Interrupted his brother. My old climbing glasses.
Your present to me when I went out, yes. So really, you helped me to save my life. I told the old Turk that. I was always thinking about you.
And the Turk?
No doubt. Through my mind, that is. At any rate, he asked a lot of questions about you. I showed him your photo. He died, poor chap. At least they told me so. Probably they shot him.
And All the Earth a Grave by C.C. MacApp. It all began when the new bookkeeping machine of a large Midwestern coffin manufacturer slipped a cog, or blew a transistor, or something. It was fantastic that the error, one of 2 decimal places, should enjoy a straight run of OKs, human and mechanical, clear down the line. But when the figures clacked out at the last clacking out station, there it was. The figures were now sacred, immutable, and it is doubtful whether the president of the concern or the chairman of the board would have dared question them, even if either of those gentlemen had been in town. As for the advertising manager, the last thing he wanted to do was question them. He carried them. They were the budget for the coming fiscal year, into his office, staggering a little on the way, and dropped dazedly into his chair. They showed the budget for his own departure as exactly 100 times what he'd been expecting. That is to say, 50 times what he'd put in for. When the initial shock began to wear off, his face assumed an expression of intense thought. In about 5 minutes, he leapt from his chair, dashed out of the office with a shouted syllable or two for his secretary, and got his car out of the parking lot. At home, he tossed clothes into a traveling bag and barged towards the door, giving his wife a quick kiss and an equally quick explanation. He didn't bother to call the airport. He meant to be on the next plane east, and no nonsense about it. With one thing and another, the economy hadn't been exactly in overdrive that year, and predictions for the Christmas season were gloomy. Early retail figures bore them out. Gift buying dribbled along feebly until Thanksgiving, despite brave speeches by the administration. The holiday passed more in self-pity than in thankfulness among owners of gift-oriented businesses. Then, on Friday following Thanksgiving, the coffin ads struck. Struck may be too mild a word. People on the streets saw feverishly working crews at holiday rates slapping up posters on billboards. The first poster was a dilly. A toothy and toothsome young woman leaned over a coffin she'd been unwrapping. She smiled, as if she had just received overtures of matrimony from an 80-year-old billionaire. There was a Christmas tree in the background, and the coffin was appropriately wrapped. So was she. She looked as if she had just gotten out of bed, or were ready to get into it. For amorous young men, and some not so young, the message was plain. The motto, "The gift that will last more than a lifetime," seemed hardly the point. Those at home were assailed on TV with a variety of bright and clever skits of the same import. Some of them hinted that if the young lady's gratitude were really precipitous and the bedroom too far away, the coffin might be comfy. Of course, the more settled elements of the population were not neglected. For the older married men, there was a blow directly between the eyes. "Do you want your widow to be half safe?" And for the spinster, without immediate hopes, "I dreamt I was caught dead without my virgin form casket." Newspapers, magazines, and every other medium added to the assault, never letting it cool. It was the most horrendous campaign for sheer concentration that had ever battered at the public mind. The public reeled, blinked, shook its head to clear it, gawked, and rushed out to buy. Christmas was not going to be a failure after all. Department store managers who had, grudgingly and under strong sales pressure, made space for a single coffin somewhere at the rear of the store, now rushed to the telephones like touts with a direct pronouncement from a horse. Everyone who possibly could got into the act. Grocery supermarkets put in casket departments. The Association of Pharmaceutical Retailers, who felt that they had some claim to priority, tried to get court injunctions to keep caskets out of service stations, but were unsuccessful because the judges were all out buying caskets. Beauty parlors showed real ingenuity in merchandising. Roads and streets clogged with delivery trucks, rented trailers, and whatever else could haul a coffin. The stock market went completely mad. Strikes were declared and settled within hours. Congress was called into session early. The president got authority to ration lumber and other materials suddenly in starvation short supply. State laws were passed against cremation under heavy lobby pressure. A new racket called boxjacking blossomed overnight. The advertising manager who had put the thing over had been fighting with all the formidable weapons of his breed to make his plant managers build up a stockpile. They had, but it went like a toupee in a wind tunnel. Competitive coffin manufacturers were caught napping, but by Wednesday after Thanksgiving, they, along with the original one, were on a 24-hour, 7-day basis. Still, only a fraction of the demand could be met. Jet passenger planes were stripped of their seats, supplied with Yankee gold, and sent to plunder the world of its coffins. It might be supposed that Christmas goods, other than caskets, would take a bad dumping. That was not so. Such was the upsurge of prosperity, and such was the shortage of coffins, that nearly everything, with a few exceptions, enjoyed the biggest season on record. On Christmas Eve, the frenzy slumped to a crawl, though on Christmas morning there were still optimists out prowling the empty stores. The nation sat down to breathe. Mostly, it sat on coffins, because there wasn't space in the living rooms for any other furniture. There was hardly an individual in the United States who didn't have, in case of sudden sharp pains in the chest, several boxes to choose from. As for the rest of the world, it had better not die just now, or it would be literally a case of dust to dust. Of course, everyone expected a doozy of a slump after Christmas, but our advertising manager, who by now was of course sales manager and first vice president also, wasn't settling for any boom and bust. He'd been a frustrated victim of his choice of industries for so many years that now, with his teeth in something, he was going to give it the old bite. He gave people a short breathing spell to arrange their coffin payments and move the presents out of the front rooms. Then, in late January, his new campaign came down like 100 megatonner. Within a week, everyone saw quite clearly that his Christmas models were now obsolete. The coffin became the new status symbol. The auto industry was, of course, demolished. Even people who had enough money to buy a new car weren't going to trade in the old one and let the new one stand out in the rain. The garages were full of coffins. Petroleum went along with autos, though there were those who whispered knowingly that the same people merely moved over into a new industry. It was noticeable that the center of it became Detroit. A few trucks and buses were still being built, but that was all. Some of the new caskets were true works of art. Others, well, there was variety. Compact models appeared, in which the occupant's feet were to be doubled up alongside his ears. One manufacturer pushed a circular model, claiming that by all the laws of nature, the fetal position was the only right one. At the other extreme were virtual houses, ornate and lavishly equipped. Possibly the largest of all was the togetherness model, triangular with graduated recesses for father, mother, 8 children plus 2 playmates, and, in the far corner beyond, the baby and the cat. The slump was over. Still, economists swore that the new boom couldn't last either, they reckoned, without the advertising manager, whose eyes gleamed brighter all the time. People already had coffins, which they polished and kept on display, sometimes in the new coffin ports being added to houses. The advertising manager's reasoning was direct and to the point. He must get people to use the coffins, and now he had all the money to work with that he could use. The new note was woven in so gradually that it is not easy to put a finger on any one ad and say, it began there. One of the first was surely the widely printed one showing a tattooed, smiling young man with his chin thrust out manfully, lying in a coffin. He was rugged-looking and likable, not too rugged for the spindly limb to identify with, and he oozed, even though obviously dead, virility at every pore. He was probably the finest-looking corpse since Richard the Lion-Hearted. Neither must one overlook the singing commercials. Possibly the catchiest of these, a really cute little thing, was achieved by jazzing up the funeral march. It started gradually, and it was all so unviolent that few saw it as suicide. Teenagers began having popping-off parties. Some of their elders protested a little, but adults were taking it up too. The tired, the unappreciated, the ill and the heavy-laden lay down in growing numbers and expired. A black market in poisons operated for a little while, but soon pinched out. Such was the pressure of persuasion that few needed artificial aids. The boxes were very comfortable. People just closed their eyes and exited smiling. The beatniks, who had their own models of coffin, moldy, scroungy, and without lids, since the beatniks insisted on being seen, placed their boxes on the Grant Avenue in San Francisco. They died with highly intellectual expressions, and eventually were washed by the gentle rain. Of course, there were voices shouting calamity. When aren't there? But in the long run, and not a very long one at that, they availed not. It isn't hard to imagine the reactions of the rest of the world, so let us imagine a few. The Communist bloc immediately gave its stamp of disapproval, denouncing the movement as a filthy capitalist, imperialist pig plot. Red China, which had been squabbling with Russia for some time about a matter of method, screamed for immediate war. Russia exposed this as patent stupidity, saying that if the capitalists wanted to die, warring upon them would only help them. China surreptitiously tried out the thing as an answer to excess population and found it good. It also appealed to the well-known melancholy facet of Russian nature. Besides, after pondering for several days, the Red Bloc decided it could not afford to fall behind in anything, so it started its own program, explaining with much logic how it differed. An elderly British philosopher endorsed the movement on the grounds that a temporary setback in evolution was preferable to facing up to anything. The Free Bloc, the Red Bloc, the Neutral Bloc, and such scraps as had been too obtuse to find themselves a bloc were drawn into the whirlpool in an amazingly short time, if in a variety of ways. In less than 2 years, the world was rid of most of what had been bedeviling it. Oddly enough, the country where the movement began was the last to succumb completely. Or perhaps it's not so odd. Coffin maker to the world, the American casket industry had by now almost completely automated box making and grave digging. With some interesting assembly lines and packaging arrangements, there still remain the jobs of management and distribution. The president of General Mortuary, an ebullient fellow affectionately called Sarcophagus Sam, put it well. "As long as I have a single prospective customer and a single stockholder," he said, mangling a stogie and beetling his brows at the one reporter who'd showed up for the press conference, "I'll try to put him in a coffin so I can pay him a dividend." Finally, though, a man who thought he must be the last living human wandered contentedly about the city of Denver, looking for the coffin he liked best. He settled at last upon a rich mahogany number with platinum trimmings, an automatic, self-adjusting, cadaver contour inner spring wherever plastic-covered mattress with a built-in bar. He climbed in, drew himself a generous slug of fine scotch, giggled as the mattress prodded him exploringly, closed his eyes and sighed in solid comfort. Soft music played as the lid closed itself. From a building nearby, a turkey buzzard swooped down, cawing in raucous anger because it had let its attention wander for a moment. It was too late. It clawed, screaming at the solid cover, hissed in frustration, and finally gave up. It flapped into the air again, still grumbling. It was tired of living on dead, small rodents and coyotes. It thought it would take a swing over to Los Angeles, where the pickings were pretty good. As it moved westward over parched hills, it espied two black dots a few miles to its left. It circled over for a closer look, then grunted and went on its way. It had seen them before. The old prospector and his burro had been in the mountains for so long, the buzzard had concluded they didn't know how to die. The prospector, whose name was Adams, trudged behind his burro toward the buildings that shimmered in the heat, humming to himself now and then or addressing some remark to the beast. When he reached the outskirts of Denver, he realized something was amiss. He stood and gazed at the quiet scene. Nothing moved except some skinny pack rats and a few sparrows foraging for grain among the unburied coffins. "Tarnation," he said to the burro. "Martians?" A half-buried piece of newspaper fluttered in the breeze. He walked forward slowly and picked it up. It told him enough so that he understood. "They're gone, Evie," he said to the burro. "All gone." He put his arm affectionately around her neck. "I reckon it's up to me and you again. We gotta start all over." He stood back and gazed at her with mild reproach. "I sure hope they don't favor your side of the house so much this time." And there we have it. Classic Horror and Other Stories, Volume 3. We hope that you enjoyed these stories. We hope that you will subscribe to the channel, like the videos, make a couple of comments, And share this with your family and friends. Hell, share it with your enemies. Just help us get the word out there about our channel. We would appreciate that greatly. Again, thank you for coming and spending your time with us. Until the next time, take care of yourself and have sweet dreams.